Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jen Cole. I am coming to you from the past, current, and future lands of the Acoma, O'odham, Maricopa, and Peepash people that share boundaries with the state of Arizona. I am a middle-aged white woman with glasses and short hair, and I am in my dining room that has some art and some desert plants behind me, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with these amazing humans today. I go by she, her pronouns, and I work at Arizona State University, where the team I collaborate with facilitates partnerships, collaborations around research and network building in the Southwest that really try to center healthy, equitable, and sustainable cultural work in the United States. I am going to pass it off to Ruffin, who's next on my screen for some intros, and then we'll come back to set this up and get into conversation.
Yeah, hey everyone, greetings from Santa Ana Pueblo, which is just north of Albuquerque in New Mexico. This is the home of the Santa Ana tribe, and they still own their land. I'm here hosting an unconference right now, so forgive me if you hear some background noise at some point. I am currently the interim chief marketing officer at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco. I also am the founder of an organization called Crux, which really focuses on digital creativity for Black artists, working in virtual reality and augmented reality spaces. I am outside, and it's really nice out. Lots of sunshine. I'm wearing a shirt with a bunch of cacti on it, and I've got green glasses on. Cool. I'll kick it to Hollis, because you're right above me on the screen.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ruffin. Hi, everyone. My name is Hollis Wong Ware. I am a resident of Los Angeles, which is Tongva land. And currently I am sitting in kind of a dark Baroque room with a purple, what would you call this? A drapage behind me, also wearing glasses and a black turtleneck and a beige scarf. I'm a musician and a songwriter, and for the last 12 years, I have been a freelance creative doing hundreds of different things, it feels like. But now my work, especially during the pandemic, has been centered kind of in the intersecting realms of public policy work, arts policy work, and creative production. So working alongside nonprofits and cause-based movements to tell stories, raise funds, amplify causes through multimedia campaigns. And I'll pass it off to Mallory.
Hey everyone, Mallory Roxana Nizam calling in from St. Louis, Missouri in the Midwest, which is also Sioux, Kickapoo, Peoria, Osage, Miami, and Quapaw lands. I go by she, her, hers, my pronouns. I am a mid-30s brown woman with long hair, glasses, and a really colorful scarf today. I'm a creative consultant and a civic artist. My independent practice is named Justice and Joy, and I work to blend urban planning, public policy, and arts into a cross-sector practice. And I do this as a consultant, a strategist, and a coach. I also recently co-founded CARE Lab, which stands for Civic Artists in Residence in Government. And we're working to grow artists in residence in government programs around the country. We also do research. And I am also the curator of partnerships and programming for Forward, which is a new digital publication by Forecast Public Art. And I'll hand it to Alensa.
Hi, everyone. It's always great to be in such amazing and inspirational company. My name is Alensa Michelle, and I am currently based in Boston, Massachusetts, on Massachusetts tribal land. I am an African-American woman, and I am wearing a blue headdress, green top, and I'm sitting in my apartment. I am an urban planner, a social practice artist, and an equity, diversity, inclusion trainer. I am the program officer for humanities, arts, and culture at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I'm also the founder of a civic practice called Powerful Pathways, where we work in community planning, design, and strategic visioning and plan and projects through the use of arts and media arts to facilitate creative learning and racial justice work. And I'm happy to be here.
Oh my gosh, every time I get to be with these humans, I'm so excited. So today we have been talking for the last day and a half about big theoretical, aspirational, where we want to be, what is possible. And we've been talking a lot about creative workers. And this is the moment where we get to not leave behind any of those aspirational ideas of what is possible, but we actually want to talk to creative workers. And we've assembled a team of people who I think are a snapshot of the complexity of the creative workforce in this country. And I want to just, and really this session is intended to be a dialogue between these humans and kind of their experiences. I think we're going to go between kind of what is the moment right now, where are they finding support, sustain and sustenance in their own creative practice, and kind of what are the places of abundance that they see sort of moving forward. One of the centering questions as we kind of imagined together was, what would culture work look like? What would creative practices look like? What would networks and professional supports look like if they loved Black and Indigenous people? So that was kind of a centering construct in our discussions with each other that I sort of want to use as a grounding moment that I hope we can all keep coming back to. But I want to give us just a snapshot of data that I think most of us on this call and this discussion will be familiar with, but just because I think it's so urgent. One is that, between 25 and 40% of the American workforce works in gig. We are a country that doesn't love workers. And culture workers are one of many exploited workforces in our country who don't have the supports that they need to often make living and alive. In fact, 25% of all creative workers have health insurance, which means 75% do not. And just above 30% actually have any sort of retirement savings or future savings of any sort. So we currently are living in a space of precarity, which has been exacerbated by generational lack of wealth building and generational and the traumas that we've all experienced in the last 24 months. And but what we also know about the workforce is that it's increasingly female identifying. It's heavily populated by BIPOC humans who sort of do cultural and creative work. And what we know by studies over the last handful of years, starting with the Urban Institute study in 2003, followed up by Creativity Connects, and continues to be evolved, is that more and more and more creative workers are actually working outside the nonprofit industrial complex. They are individual content creators. They are employee-owned sole employee businesses. They are working in the solidarity economy, co-op models, and that the structures, which we've all talked about over the last couple of days, that support and sort of provide opportunities for creative workers are really not matching who the workers themselves are. And particularly these wonderful humans also do this transdisciplinary, transsector practice. Almost everybody on this call engages themselves in some way, shape, or form in public policy, in movement making, and in their individual and sort of primary creative practice. And so I would sort of say that everybody's love language here is change and creativity. And so I think if we know that this is what the workforce is, and these four humans are great examples of the people in the workforce, then we have to approach the complexity and this rapid change and transformation with that same level of abundance and imagination, while not walking away from the fact that this is really hard. And so as we kind of kick the session off, we're hoping kind of to walk through a conversation, really that like, what are you sitting with right now? Like, what is really affecting your work, impacting your work? What are you sort of sitting with right now? A little bit of a conversation about networks, like how are you being rejuvenated? Who are your collaborators? What does peer support look like for you? And then if those supports were scaled and resourced and validated and visibilized, what would that look like really at scale? Like, how might we sort of begin to imagine a future where the things that maybe are sustaining you at a very individual level could grow? And we'll kind of work through that arc of a conversation, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions. But I want to sort of turn it, I'll kick it over to Hollis to begin. Sort of, what are you sitting with right now? What's the big, hairy, audacious thing that's like affecting your personal practice? Like, what's a complexity that you're sitting with as a culture worker?
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that thoughtful framing. And yeah, it's incredible to be in company with all of these speakers. I was just kind of like feel like just like the aspirational outsider when I hear of everybody's accolades and the work that they're doing that's so meaningful. I think for me, it's interesting that you framed citing the move away from nonprofit work, because I feel like that's really what kick-started my entree into being a terminal gig worker, as I kind of feel like I am now. My first experience out of college was working for an arts nonprofit, and on paper, everything was amazing. I was working with young people. I was getting to do cultural programming. I felt like this was the professionalization I desired as an aspiring artist who wanted to make a career in community and in artwork. And within 2 years, I left that job feeling like I never wanted to ever work for a nonprofit ever again. I was like, these structures are colonial. The board is I just was so incensed by how much the nonprofit structure perpetuated the status quo and how much it contained us to being just entrapped in the same systems that on one side we would say that we were trying to escape and evolve from, and yet we were paying dues to and lip service to folks that were not interested in collective liberation in any way. And I think for me, I took that as a challenge to think, okay, well, I am going to try to be an independent artist, to take as many different jobs as I can, to not feel like I belong in any one sector or even try to like professionalize myself in that way. But, this was pre like Uber, Instacart, but I definitely had that same mentality, which is like wherever I could make it work, I would. And I'm thankful that I've been able to essentially be a freelancer for over 10 years now. Both in my arts practice as a musician and a performing artist, as well as doing, scrappy communications work and creative production work. And the pandemic was really what was the disruptor for me, because my primary income was really as a performing artist and as an artist. And so I really had the rug pulled out from under me and had to figure out what was my worth outside of being a performer. We had been sold as a performing artist. We'd been sold this idea, especially in music, like, oh, it's really hard to make music, recorded music or whatever, but live, like that's recession proof. Live is always going to be consistent and sustained. And of course, the pandemic disrupted everything, including our livelihoods as live performers. So I think what I have been thinking about, and I'm curious what other folks have been thinking about as well, is just for those of us whose livelihood was so dependent on that live convening and bringing folks together. And that's where I really found like solace and motivation. How are we feeling in this like perpetual kind of isolation? I mean, the fact that we're all here looking at each other on screens, how are we being fed and fueled? And how are we feeling motivated by possibilities ahead when everything has felt very unending and disrupted? I think that's where I'm personally sitting right now.
I can chime in. Hollis, when you were speaking, I was thinking about my own transition to become independent. And what you shared resonated with me. I think that I too, when I moved into an independent practice, which for me was full time about 3 years ago, I felt like I could better align with my values and my mission if I was independent, and I had a lot more flexibility and autonomy to build a practice that was squarely in what I was doing, which is and was so cross sector that it was really hard to find a space where anyone could hire me full time to do the thing that I wanted to do. So it's like, I think probably for all of us, it's like in order to have to imagine the world into being that I want to exist, and that includes the kind of job that I want. However, it's so much work. It's like so much work to run your own practice, or to be your own boss and run your own business and pitch your work and do your accounting and hire, other people to work with you, to find relationship maintenance, all this stuff, that I think sometimes when I tell people I work for myself, they like over glorify what that means. And while I do get this mission alignment, value alignment, and better pay in the end, which is another thing that I needed, there are all these startup costs, and I'm just one person. And when you have a team, or a large organization, you usually have like a staff person doing that. So I'm the HR, I'm the accounting, I'm the legal team, I write the contracts. It's a lot of work. And I'm glad that I have some peers that I can jam on that stuff with when I have questions. I have a few listservs I go to, and I know we're going to talk more about support networks later, but it's, I just kind of want to lift up that, especially in the pandemic, I've seen a fair amount of people leave full-time roles. There's like data that shows that that's happening in various industries. And I try to kind of share the story with folks when they leave, because there just really are not a lot of mechanisms to support independent workers who are, it really is about doing the work that you want to do, and having the work-life balance that works for you. That was another thing that I was seeking, but it's not without its like logistical and administrative challenges.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, as someone who, in particular, part about like the sort of startup costs and how hard it is to run your own business. So I've inherited a couple of organizations that were already up and running, and knew that when I started Crux, we were always supposed to be small and nimble, and we grew so much last year. Like we grew from being a relatively small organization with just me and a consultant doing a lot of the work to, we've got 14 worker owners right now. And have done in the last 18 months, like close to $1.5 million in business, which administratively, like totally just made everything really hard to grow that fast. But what I'm really sitting with is like thinking about holding a couple of things. The first being that Black women are the fastest growing class of entrepreneurs, and are most likely, for the next several decades that's going to be the trend with Black and brown women starting businesses. And they'll probably be solopreneurs. So how do we build systems of support to capitalize them long term? The second thing is something that Jen and I have spoken about at length, which is the rise of digital creatives. So, if Black and brown people are going to over-index in terms of being content creators, in terms of being gig workers and everything else, how do we build infrastructure for them to be successful and to capitalize themselves, and to really take things like YouTube and OnlyFans, which right now are pretty top-down oppressive platforms that are still colonial, and really using them as pulling some levers to make them an opportunity for folks to reach middle class. How do we capitalize mortgages and small business loans and that sort of thing. And then I think about my 16-year-old niece who wants to go to medical school, not because she wants to be a doctor, but because she wants to make medical TikToks. So how do we hold all of those things at once?
I love that. That's so cool. That's like public health education, and that she's willing to dedicate herself to create. I don't know. I think if there's anything, I don't know if we're at the what gives us hope in this time. But the fact that given these platforms and how top down and like deeply oppressive and exploitative they are of creative, just creativity and IP and what we're creating as consumers. Just the boundless imagination and creativity that's unleashed by these platforms that allows young people to feel like they have the tools and the capacities and the access to audience to create. I think that's so much when I think about when I was starting off as a musician, it was like my audience was whoever showed up that night. Like it was really whoever was in the room. And there was a beauty to that. There was kind of this amazing, tangible IRL experience that I think I lament now in the age of streaming, like especially as a creator myself. Like I don't get excited or motivated by like releasing a song on Spotify or making a post on Instagram. Like those things feel compromising to me as a creator. But then you think about your niece and the idea of being motivated by essentially creating public health content in a creative format, and that excites me and makes me think, oh, okay, well, there are possibilities. But it goes back to, Ruffin, what you were just talking about, the ownership of who owns this content and what platforms are we on. And it feels, I know for me as a creator, it feels inherently compromising to have platforms such as like a Spotify or just all of these big corporate, big tech platforms whose business models are built on the continual and systematic exploitation of original content, primarily of Black and brown people. How do we create a new way where we can foster the creativity of your niece and like the essential education that she wishes to create, but not do it in a way that continues to like fuel and put money in the pockets of these companies that in the end just don't really care about us at all. Something I think about a lot.
I do think, Hollis, you asked the question of what has changed for us in the pandemic, or how has that kind of thrown a wrench in or opened up opportunities in our careers. And I do think, for a long time, I've felt like the arts have not, really embraced digital tools in the way that we could. And I think that is highlighted a little bit more in the pandemic. I mean, it's, I, as somebody who does place-based work, like that's like been gone for me for a year and a half. And, really had to rely on digital tools, and they're just not well integrated into a lot of the spaces that I operate in. So I think there are a lot of opportunities there that can and could give creatives more, I don't know, it's a creative platform and more autonomy, and kind of like the example of the TikTok videos, a little bit more independence in creating content, creating period, but not without the complication. I feel like everything we've said so far is like kind of a double-edged sword. It's like you get a lot of freedom when you do something, but then that your content is owned by somebody else, your data is owned by somebody else. It's hard to really fully escape some of the negatives of the larger systems we're operating in.
Alensa, do you have thoughts about that?
I apologize, having connection issues, and I think it's just one of the many structural inequities that one has to deal with, having now working from home. And I live in a historically underserved neighborhood in Boston that doesn't have the greatest broadband access. So it speaks to a whole slew of other things. But as I was listening to you all, I was reflecting on conversations that I've had with artists, in particular artists of color, who feel like they have to make a sacrifice between their artistic practice and putting a meal on their table and supporting themselves and their families. And there are so many folks that I interact with, from Uber drivers to artists that I connect with at vendor fairs, who all talk about how they have other jobs, and this they've been trying to build, this idea of their dream. Like I hear a lot of artists say, like, yeah, this work is my dream, and I'm just doing this hustle and grind trying to make it, and it becomes this thing where this idea of a hustle, your side job, your side work is really your true passion, and you have to put it aside to focus on fitting in within the current confines of workforce development structure. And I can relate to this in my own life, because I would love to be able to focus on my practice full time. And I think to Mallory's point, that the fact that even when I was running my practice full time and trying to go from gig to gig, and you're not really certain when the next job is going to come in, and then you have to figure out how to bring in staff and then manage those teams, and you don't get to really keep or claim any of the great work that you've done. You can't really do much with it. So I thought that I was doing work that allowed me to be in what I called the fourth space, not quite public, not quite nonprofit, not quite private, but kind of a hybrid model of all three. And there are barriers within each of those sectors that then meant they were amalgamated and were barriers that we faced with Powerful Pathways. And even now, having to work with clients who don't have the same equity lens that you do, who don't value the role of artistic practice and its the unique opportunities it brings in planning, design, and policy work in the way that it matters to me, and particularly trying to develop more culturally responsive projects and policies, is another layer of work that I didn't anticipate going into this. And despite all of that, I still consider myself one of the lucky ones. I still consider myself one of the ones that managed to be able to start my own practice and be able to navigate spaces where there are distinct barriers for artists. And some of it was, trying to exercise my own savviness. Some of it was luck, and some of it was by pushing down some doors and, making a few enemies in the process. But I don't really care, because it had to be done, frankly. But it's challenging, because when I live in the neighborhood that I grew up in, and after living in different cities and in different places, I moved back here about 10 years ago, because I specifically wanted to do focused work here in my community. And I know folks who have left in the 70s and came back and said, wow, this community hasn't changed a bit. Like, one of the initiatives that I started here in Boston is Mattapan Open Streets, Open Studios, where we use the arts to facilitate neighborhood revitalization projects of different kinds. And so we go beyond murals. So we've been thinking about the built environment and how to bring about functional art projects in the community. And it's largely because as a neighborhood, we never had even an open studios, which, for those who may not be familiar, open studios is a 30+ long tradition here in the Boston area, where artist studios would be open to the public for a week or a weekend, and there would be a series of supplementary community events and activities with local businesses and organizations that are designed around that, to not only celebrate local art and promote local traffic, but to local artists, but also to spark community and economic development opportunities. And the neighborhood that I live in has never had one, even though we have a number of artists who live here. And even though there is a lot of talk about value, and the value of artists and the value of creating more economic development opportunities in this community, something as simple as that didn't exist until, I started it with others about 4 years ago. So it's a reminder You know, and this is also a neighborhood that doesn't have any artist studios. There's no artist spaces. We don't have a community arts center. We don't have artist studio space. So most artists either have to operate out of their homes, which present potential health hazard issues. Like I do my art in my in here in my apartment, and I probably shouldn't. And I'm glad that my landlord's not watching. But I also know that some folks feel that they have to go outside of the community in order to practice in their art making. And it also means that the trickle down of resources don't make it here. The opportunity for professional development doesn't make it here. And the overall sort of perception that arts do not play a vital role in communities also is another thing that gets transitioned or passed on. Even though it's unspoken, it's felt, you know, when there is a lack of investment. So it's part of the whole ecosystem when we think about the role of workers and access to opportunity in jobs, and how do you make your full-time job your passion? You know, other career paths, it's possible, but it's very difficult when you're a creative. Not to get all gloom and gloom, although, by the way, I just think that, you know, it's important to kind of highlight what the gaps are and what's missing so that we can better address what's needed and come out of this with some very clear pathways for increasing workforce amount opportunities for creatives.
So all of you are talking about sort of issues of ownership and clearly around ownership of your content and your creative work, and also like hidden labor, right? Which I think is really about being a solopreneur. What is that hidden labor? So what are the networks that you're working in that are, I mean, some of you have talked about that are facilitating kind of partnerships, collaborations that are kind of in mutual aid and support, right?
Could I just touch on one thing quickly, just from Alyssa? First of all, I didn't think it was doom and gloom. I really, really appreciated what you shared, and from your broadband, like, you know, lapsing to like what you shared about just a virtual lack of creative infrastructure and cultivation and resources in your community for arts, and like recognizing that when, you know, like, I mean, just like these vague but like very pointed concepts of like underserved communities and how do we serve underserved communities, and arts continues to start to feel like this like extracurricular thing, instead of recognizing that like all communities, especially communities of color, low-income communities, however you want to say it, oftentimes are actually hubs of creativity, oftentimes are like where the most interesting, innovative, radical, collaborative work is being done, and yet are the least resourced with the more traditional like programming and activities that a city claims is to be their arts and cultural identity, when really it's like the dopest artists, recording artists, like visual artists, like they're all coming from places that do not have that like overlay of creative infrastructure. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I don't know a lot about Boston, so that was really great to hear. And it was interesting because it made me think about in Seattle, which is where I spent a lot of my time. I live in LA now, but sorry, another thing that you said that made me think of what I'm about to say is you speaking about like the balance of trying to hold yourself as a professional, but also pursue your arts practice. And there was something really interesting. A good friend of mine, Moni Tepp, she is a co-director at an organization called Creative Justice, which is a alternative to incarceration of juvenile, like of young people essentially that have been like identified for potential juvenile detention, but instead there's kind of this arts alternative. And then in their role, they actually have in their job description that 10 hours a week of their job is supposed to be spent on their arts practice, because the folks that created the organization recognize that there's this false equivalency between working in the arts and being a working artist, right? Like, we take all the great, bright, creative minds and then we make us do administrative work 50 to 60 hours a week. Like, what is this? So I thought that was an interesting, scrappy solve. And I think for them, they were even kind of trying to like navigate, like, how can I do this? How can I get into the studio and then also come back and answer a ton of emails? But at least like the space had been made there structurally for them to explore it. And it kind of, that to me indicated, like, as Mallory was talking about, it's like you're the HR, you're the person who's telling yourself like what your schedule is, and it's always going to be the more urgent, responsive, administrative stuff that supersedes your creative work and your own personal pursuit of your artistry. So that's what that brought up to me before we move into systems. I was just like, I wanted to reflect on that personal stuff.
So I'll jump in. Jen, you were asking about systems of support. And I'm also going to kind of pull Alensa and Hollis's last comments and then answer this question. So I was just kind of writing some notes, and I was just thinking, you know, one of the things that I find myself and my peers who I chat with frequently about our practices, and when I say my peers, I mostly mean folks who are either independent or have dreams of becoming independent, which is kind of everybody. And so I think I spend about 50% of my time making the case for my work. And Alensa, I think you were hitting on that. Like, my work is vital. You should believe in it. You should start to open your mind a bit, take the risk, try this out, center equity, hire BIPOC people. And then the other half of it, as like traditional business strategy, is filling the need. It's like, where is the demand for my practice? And I have to mold my practice. Like when the pandemic hit, I molded my practice so much around the demand, which wasn't really what I wanted to do, but I had to. And Hollis, you were alluding to that too. Like, okay, you can't do live performance. Well, you gotta switch it up. And that's hard for creatives because like we want to do things that the world isn't always ready for. So there's this tension between supply and demand, and I feel like I'm often trying to create the demand, but also be realistic about where the demand is. So that going back and forth between that is challenging in a business strategy, and also from a just, I don't know, like setting goals and aspirations. So those are the kinds of things that I often grapple with my peers. I have a few regular calls with people that I've set up like monthly. And those are people that are independent or aspiring to become independent. And we kind of just talk about any and everything. We usually talk about our businesses, but also just personal lives because it's all connected, as well as our creative practices. That's really sustaining for me, like maintaining these really intimate connections with people, and having them regularly scheduled. Obviously, that takes a lot of time, one-on-ones. There are some listservs that have been kind of practically helpful for me to gather resources. If I'm like, hey, I need like a designer to help me with some branding and logo stuff, who do you recommend? Or I need to change my healthcare, or what are people doing for 401ks now that tax codes have changed or something like that. So I have a few listservs that have been helpful in that respect. And those one-on-ones, and that's about it for me. And it's helping me get by, but I'm about to really have to change my healthcare situation, and I don't really like, I wish there was a collective buy-in kind of thing where we could all pool, like all of us here, and buy healthcare together, or even like have a graphic designer on retainer that we could all share, some kind of collective purchasing power. And Ruffin, you may have some things going there too with some of the work that you're doing, but these are things that I'm not quite plugged into yet. I'm 3 years into my independent practice, and you really have to just kind of find those things on your own. And if you miss them, you miss them. And there's just not a lot of, at least from my vantage point, a lot of formal systems designed to help support me. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think that as a cross-sector practitioner, Maybe y'all can relate to this, but there's a lot of like code switching that has to happen. I'm like, oh, I'm in a policy environment. Remember your acronyms. And then I'm like, oh, I'm with a bunch of poets. Like, let your brain wander and be creative with your vocabulary. And then I might be in a totally different environment with planners, which might be like a blend of those things. And but also from a like practical, like administrative perspective, it means like pay scales are different with each of those industries. And what is it called? Well, just like onboarding or what is that word? What is it in government? I can't think of it right now. Procurement. That's what it is. Procurement. Procurement processes are different. Contracts are totally different in different sectors. And so that's like another hidden labor thing that I often have to go to my community and ask people about, because otherwise, I'm creating all these new structures all the time. And I can't be an expert in every single field, but I do think there's value in me as a creative practitioner collaborating with a lot of different fields, but it doesn't mean that I need to know the ins and outs of each of them. And so that's, thankfully, I'm well connected and I have a network, but it is a lot of kind of one-on-one conversations or those listservs that give me some more insight into how I can structure things when I'm working with a new sector.
Yeah, I mean, I feel you on that, like, so much, just with, oh, can y'all hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Alyssa, when you were talking about broadband, I worked for Comcast in 2007, 2008 as a lobbyist when Comcast and Verizon like divvied up the country with regard to who gets broadband and who didn't. And out here on a res, like the internet just is awful. So I'm feeling you. But I spent a lot of time thinking about the level of privilege that I had working at Fractured Atlas with unlimited vacation, sort of remote work, being able to set my own schedules, to be able to like deeply research everything I needed to, and I have a law degree, right? So like just the level of privilege to be able to like learn health insurance stuff, to be able to take the time to teach myself about starting a co-op, because it's not information that's easily accessible. So right now, some of the networks that I'm really enjoying the most and sort of teach me the most are solidarity economy networks. Start.coop, which has an accelerator for people who are starting co-ops, is really helpful. Angie Kim at CCI introduced me to my attorney, who's one of my favorite people. He's a co-op attorney. So I think, sort of the winding path of finding people is hard when you're trying to do this work. Yeah, and on the health insurance thing, faith-based communities actually do a really good job with pooling resources for health insurance. They actually, a number of them, in particular in the South, forego health insurance altogether. They pay money into a pool, and then you're able to pull it out when you need coverage for big things. And I've been thinking a lot about how can creative communities do things like that. I mean, you can obviously join regardless of whether you're a part of the faith-based community, but there's also a company called Opolis that is a cooperative healthcare company. So there are things out there, but again, like I had to go down like deep into rabbit holes on the internet to like find this stuff. It's not easily accessible, and it really is about like having the privilege and the time to do it. And Hollis, on the music ownership piece, Ampled is a co-op out of New York that is owned by musicians, and they're building a platform for musician support. And I don't know, you might have heard of them or spoken with Austin, who's amazing. But, I think a lot of these, there's an organization called Peep.me that's been around for a couple of years. They're starting a worker-owned OnlyFans because we knew OnlyFans was going to deplatform sex workers, and then it happened. So I've been advising them for a while, and they're gaining some traction. But like these sort of, platform co-ops where creatives are owning the platform itself ends up becoming a tipping point for us sort of getting to where we need to go. And it does require us starting things, like not just sort of waiting for people to start them for us. We really do have to get out there and sort of get outside of our comfort zones and band together to be able to start these platform co-ops and take advantage of the technology that's out there. Because we're like this close to getting to where we need to be.
Yeah, I don't want to sideline this into just like being an independent artist, because I feel like we're, the creative worker field is so vast, but I appreciate you bringing those two organizations up. I'll just say, like, to be honest, like, and vulnerable, I guess, like, it's hard to know because you feel as a working artist that everything's against you. You're just this one person in a sea of content. 20,000 songs are being uploaded to Spotify every day. How are you going to stand out? And it's my heart and my desire is to be collective, to work in community with folks. And I think that's what has always given me like grounding and meaning and the foundation for why I do what I do. And I think, you know, it sometimes my fear, even with working with, not to say that I'm like afraid of working with like community collaborative co-ops, because like to me that's a great opportunity, but I think artists, we feel like our resources and our attention is so scarce, and it's like, do we try to crack through that which exists, or do we take a risk and start something new? And will we be, you know, will that inhibit our ability to grow in certain ways? And I think that's a navigation, that's a kind of fundamental dilemma that I know a lot of artists like myself are trying to wrestle with. Like, okay, like, do I try to pursue these more traditional means and try to like, because that's where a lot of the audience and the capital and the resources are kept, or do I completely abandon that and basically build it up from scratch? And will I even, kind of like what you were saying, Mallory, it's like I have to pitch people on why I'm valuable, and then I have to create valuable work. It's like, what's left at the end of the day? Like, is there a me at the end of the day? And I think about that a lot. Like for me, you know, as much as I can, you know, the more I learn about like, say, YouTube policies and think about how they're just, you know, like systematically exploiting creatives. And yet I personally am paying money for YouTube ads to promote my product on it because it's the #1 global streaming platform in the world. And these hypocrisies, I feel deeply hypocritical at every turn as an independent artist trying to like promote my work, to be seen, to build community, to by turns be deeply critical of the way that Spotify creates or handles creators. And then when I get an editorial look on a playlist, I'm like, thank you, Spotify, for playlisting me. It just feels whack. And I think it just speaks to like the ways in which we as artists need to navigate capitalism, navigate big tech, continue to like grow audiences even though we don't own them. These are all these kind of like, I'll just say they're really whack. It's like whack stuff to have to navigate, and it feels personally compromising constantly. And yet, you know, just trying to find solace in the fact that like, yeah, even just committing myself to be like, I need to be pursuing alternative modes and not just be like going into this like total corporate landscape. But again, it's like the scarcity of the independent artist. Like, there's only so few opportunities. It's so hard to be seen. It's so hard to be recognized. And it's easier to choose to hack the convention instead of like really charting a new path. So thanks for calling me out, but I'm working on it. I called myself out.
Yeah, I feel so compelled to contribute to that. Just everything resonates so much from what you talked about, Mallory, in terms of like this idea of having to code switch across these different spaces, and you can't even be your full self in any of these spaces. Like, there's no single space where you can jump and be like your whole self, because there's always something that you have to negotiate, which I think it takes a toll on the soul. And yet it also kind of brings up like, you know, like artists are so darn resilient in a way that like we don't talk about and don't acknowledge, and we just have to be, you know, like the portrayal of, you know, in mass media is often this sort of negative image of like, you know, the starving artist, or the, you know, the gloomy artist who like thrives on like negativity to practice art. And it's like, that's so not true. It's just, we're just getting hit with so much, so for so long, you know. But so that's just one thought that's bubbling up for me. But I think from an organizational standpoint, so in terms of like thinking about networks and how to cycle resources and trying to navigate spaces, several years ago, I started a network in the Boston area called Boston's Black and Brown Creatives. And it's interesting how this group has evolved. We have just about 1,100 members now. And in the beginning, the only two rules that I put out there is that you have to be a creative and you have to show proof of creativity, because there were a lot of people who tried to join our group that just were sort of interested in examining as opposed to actually participating. And you have to live in Boston. And then about 3 years in, we extended it to Greater Boston because so many artists were being pushed out due to gentrification out of the city's, geographic boundaries. And so as we were thinking about like building this network, initially the idea was to create a space, and in this case a virtual space initially, so that artists can share resources without the fear of competition or having to like struggle to even find information. So we often would post residencies, job opportunities, grants, emergency grants, other types of unique roles that artists can play, different businesses when they're looking to hire artists, local artists. And then we started to add on in-person networking events because folks were really starting to express a need for coming together and having space to actually talk to each other about what their challenges are. And this was all prior to the city establishing its first ever cultural plan. So we started coming together and started talking about policy as well, and what are the ways in which we can put policy on the table in conversations and spaces of elected officials and public officials. And most recently, we are launching a directory, not necessary for external parties, although it's open to external parties because it's entirely open source, but it's a directory where artists can find each other across interests and mediums. And we found that is a need. But the other thing that I also found is like the space for artists to learn skills and create spaces for skill sharing was also a huge need. So we started organizing events that are specifically around skill sharing. And we've had a few times where government agencies have wanted to co-opt the space, or they'll say they want to partner with us, but they want to put their branding on the events that we do, which isn't really interesting. And it's just interesting how there are these formalized spaces that don't do this work, that think what we're doing is on the margins until the area of need becomes that relevant, and then they want to co-opt it and like come in and infiltrate it. And I certainly saw this last year, which is the last point that I'll make, which is around shared services and support. So through Powerful Pathways, we started a small business microloan and microfund program where we particularly just wanted to provide seed funding to immigrant entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color who were struggling to get off the ground because they didn't have access to traditional funding streams. And we quickly had to pivot during the pandemic, and we launched an artist mini grants program where artists just had to state their need and what their state of need was, and rather than having them fill out forms or they have to give up their social security number or other kinds of barriers, we say just send us your PayPal or your Venmo or Cash App and we'll forward you the funds. Anywhere between 200 to 300 mini grants. And in that process, I ended up getting invited to some of these different funder meetings where like large major funders were talking about how to respond to the pandemic and all the challenges that they were experiencing. And I'm like, why don't you just give people money who say they need it? Like, let's not judge. Let's not be sitting here judging like who deserves it the most. Just they said they need it, so give it to them.
I know, they sort of act like they're at the pearly gates or something. Like, this is not, can we just pay the people?
Exactly. And it was interesting to see that once I started speaking up in that space, like how the energy started changing. And even though that we had approached some of these same funders for matching funds, because we ended up raising about $6,000 on our own, largely through independent donors and largely taking advantage, like you're saying, Hollis, having to make use of these digital platforms that are often, can be very exploitative. But we basically did a lot of fundraising through Facebook and IG, just asking people to give. And yet the very same funders who were like saying that they were trying to figure out, how to make sure that their funding process was more equitable, were the same one when we asked them for matching funds. Not only did not give us matching funds, but then they were frustrated when I would be in the space and say, why don't you just give people money that they said that they need to just give it to them. Like, just give the artists the funds. That's all. That's really, there's no other need to go beyond that. So there's something to be said about nuance here. Like when we talk about policy, we talk about systems, but we also need to start talking a little bit about like the mindset of gatekeepers and how there are specific entities and organizations and individuals who represent those entities and or institutions that sustain certain colonized mindsets, which have a direct disparate impact on artists. And that is only exacerbated for artists of color.
I'm like so into that. And I'm gonna sound like a YBCA shill around guaranteed income because we do have a big program, but I've been on the guaranteed income thing for years. And like, I do wonder what it would look like for creatives who are having this conversation like nonstop around like how come we just can't hit like just a little bit further up the ladder? Like, how come we just can't get there? What would it look like if we organize ourselves around guaranteed income the way conservatives organize themselves around abortion and hating people of color? Like, what would it look like if we really just said guaranteed income is like, that's what we need, and we just agreed on it? Like, everything else, throw it to the side. This is the thing. Because sometimes I think we're maybe a little too inclusive. Like, maybe the tent's a little too big and it keeps us disorganized, and that's part of how the system holds us back. But everything we're dancing around right now is really like, because the value of creative labor is so subjective, we can't ever get a leg up because we're constantly having to code switch. We're working in different industries, we're in different regions, and we just can't agree that like 8 hours of our labor has X value. So guaranteed income helps us get there.
I will join you. I'm ready.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's smart. And I'm curious if we want to dial or dig in a little bit more on this idea of the tent, right sizing the tent. That was a play on code switching, because when you use like random like lexicon, when you're like, oh, that sounded so unnatural out of my mouth, and but I actually, I don't know, Lauren, could we talk more about like in our ideal like organizing block where we're really going to get like, let's just say guaranteed income or UBI confirmed? Because the ones I have thoughts too about how when you're asking corporations to give money that they owe, like, especially like, I was just thinking about that in relation to like reparations. There's just like a lot there, but I'm curious about when we're organizing for things like that, like what's the size of the tent? Like who's the most effective like organizing block for this type of advocacy work to like get us paid for the things that we do?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because like how we talk about guaranteed income has to change. Like, I live in New Mexico. I am most certain in the top 1%. New Mexico is an impoverished state. I'm in the 1% of earners in New Mexico. But I got like $600 2 or 3 times over the last 18 months to feed the kids that I live with. They're my wife's kids. That's not that I found some kids and brought them into the house. They belong to us. But like, that's guaranteed income. Like, that's a form of governmental support that like everybody who got that, which is a lot of people. I mean, at this point, like Joe Biden's giving $300 out to people regularly who have kids. Like, they should be in the tent, and we should be talking about that as a form of guaranteed income for parents. So I think the tent can be big, but I think the messaging has to be really simple. And I do worry, and I'm not the only one I know, but like, we get so complex a platform that has like, it's like 12 steps on a platform, and that's just a lot for people to go through. so if we could just like decide that like perhaps guaranteed income is the foundation for everything else we want. It's the foundation to be able to afford healthcare. It's the foundation to be able to have childcare, elder care, for us to be able to get our medicine that we need. Just like sort of a basic standard of living. If we can all agree on that, being able to afford an abortion, you know, like, or just regularize reproductive health, like that could be the platform that we can stand on to just get free.
If I could bring in my improv training here, I would say UBI or GBI, Universal Basic Income, or what is it, general? It's the guaranteed basic income, because I don't like throwing around acronyms without spelling them out. But it's kind of a yes and if we're talking about the 10. It's like, what if UBI, GBI is the big capital Y, capital E, capital S, and it doesn't exclude all of the other things we want to work towards, but it can be the thing everyone says yes to and builds on. I'm curious, I mean, I'm really interested in UBI, GBI. I've really barely started to hear my peers talk about it. It seems like I feel like nobody around me is really interested in that. Maybe if I was still living in the Bay Area, like I was a year ago, it might be different in St. Louis, and there's really not a lot of conversation around it, unfortunately. And I'm curious if, like, in the other spaces that folks are working in, living in, if this is talked about in your networks, in creative networks, and among artists and independent practitioners, because you know that's part of organizing, of course, is we have to have like the critical mass, and I'm not sure in the creative sector that we're there yet. I think we have to build it still. We may not realize that, you know, this is the golden ticket or the key. I just don't hear enough people talking about it.
I mean, this is where my Machiavellian brain switches on, and it's like, people don't know what they believe until you tell them what they believe. Like, I don't know that we've done a great job, Jen. Are you okay? They don't. Like, I mean, that's like 101 with marketing. That's why everybody's wearing Uggs right now. And what are those, Crocs?
Right.
Like, nobody would like that naturally. So
Crocs with socks too. No kidding. I don't know.
yeah. But like, I wonder if like, if we were to put all of our collective marketing, creative energy, policy chops, our resources into like that one thing, people would talk about it. So
Yeah.
and to me, it does seem key for us to, and like, I'm not in this for me, I'm like halfway in the ground already, but like, I do think about my little niece a lot. Like, what's she trying to do? And like, the future of creative work is her. How do we make sure that she and little kids like her have a shot? So they're not having this conversation that we're having right now in 20 or 30 years.
And just to be clear to folks who are tuning in, I know YBCA is doing work in this space, and Springboard for the Arts in the Twin Cities. I know the city of Pittsburgh just announced a program. There's Mayors for Guaranteed Basic Income. Like, there is movement around this. And I'm, as a former marketing professional, Ruffin, I totally hear you. And I think like messaging in this era is, in the digital era, is like so key. Simplifying things, making them digestible, making them exciting, making them relatable to everyone. I mean, that's like 101 of organizing, digital organizing too. And I also can see where it has really failed with public health, and some lessons that we can learn from the pandemic around, you know, what not to do in mass messaging.
I want to just say that I completely agree with you both that marketing and messaging is tantamount. I also think that there needs to be some level of enforcement that just needs to be enforced, as opposed to waiting for content to become popular, you know, with a mass audience. And this is actually takes me back to the research I was doing on the WPA, because we've been working on a report which will be released in a few weeks, here at the Academy on the creative workforce. And so I went and did a lot of digging on the history of the Works Progress Administration and to really kind of unpack its origins. Now, at the time, we were going through, it was, you know, a collective series of policies that emerged post Great Depression. But it was language that was just created. And, you know, a lot of people kind of look to the WPA as like a model worth replicating. I think that there's a lot of big holes in that. And it's good to see that there are some creative economy investment acts that are being explored right now in Congress. But what was particularly interesting about the WPA is really just that it just happened because it was enforced. And then folks got on board. And it wasn't like, let's wait for everyone to buy into it. It's like, let's just do it. And that eventually led to CETA, the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, which had artists embedded in spaces, working in spaces that they weren't traditionally working in before. And it was all government sponsored. And it was just something that was made to happen because it was recognized as important. And I think, you know, there are a few mayors in cities. I can't speak for suburban or rural communities, but I know of many cities where, you know, they thought to hold ballot questions to do UBI in communities that were shot down. And this was pre-pandemic, and now there's a lot of those same communities that are wishing they had embraced it. So it's just, you know, we're going through our own post-depression disaster right now, and there are going to be a lot of folks who are not interested in shared economy models without recognizing that we're all already part of a shared economy. As capitalist as it is, it's still a shared economy that we're a part of. And so sometimes it just takes, I think, just the bravery of just putting policies in place and letting others catch on and see the value and the benefit through the outcomes. Because you can't really sell outcomes. You can sell an idea, but you can't sell results. And that's one of the challenges of policy today.
So I want to talk, like, so I mean, the title of the session is The Future of Creative Work, right? So I think I think everybody is saying that the future of creative work has to be predicated on paying the people who do the work. and that you know, I'm hoping, if I can summarize, like if the brilliant minds in this room, who by their own admission are finding ways of stability, right? Have navigated instability and continue to navigate instability, but are still saying this, the huge amount of hidden administrative labor, this huge amount of contortion that has to happen to make it, or to keep making, even not even to make it, but to keep making, is sort of elemental. Then I think then, you know, we've talked a lot about this idea and that incentive and this funding mechanism and that change and this tax policy. And the reality is, like, if we listen to Black and Indigenous women and BIPOC women, they're saying loud and clear, we just need financial stability. We just need wealth building. We just need abundance. In order to be human, financial, like, moving from precarity to abundance requires something quite simple, which is
the redistribution of wealth from the
Correct.
incredible inequity from which it stands. And you can create all these programs and all these systems and all of these policy papers and white papers and convenings, but ultimately, what is it about?
Right.
It's about the fact that we have a completely unequal distribution of resources currently. And and I think that's what I'm hearing from each of the speakers here. It's like we have dedicated our lives to speaking the language of, please give me money, I'm worth it. And please give my communities money, we're worth it. And it's frankly dehumanizing, but we do it because we know how needed those resources are. And we know that we have the creativity to be able to like create these systems of change. And like, obviously this is not to discredit any of the tremendous work that happens amongst the panelists. I kind of feel like I'm a bit of a free agent because I'm an independent artist that like, now my sweet spot is I'm just trying to get money to pay my friends to do cool stuff. And so that they're good. So that's like my personal little mission, and what have you. And I'll work in different like sectors in order to make that happen. But ultimately it's like, yes, Jen, like that's what we're talking about. It's like, how do you just transmit the resources to make it so that folks can eat, live, create, thrive.
Right. And so like, if you're in this meeting and you're coming from an institutional context, like I would challenge you, and then I would like invite us to then move to Q&A questions. Like, what are you doing like as an institution to liberate yourself of those resources? What are you doing to, like, are you facilitating hidden labor? Right? Like these are questions you have to ask yourself. Like in your process, Joe Lentz's point about just Venmo me some money. Like, what are you doing to facilitate hidden labor? What are you doing to facilitate contortion? And the opposite of that, if you were to stop doing that, what would be possible, right? What would truly be possible? What would be more humane? What would be more just? And what would be creatively actually possible in communities, right? So, you know, I think that particularly white people, white-led organizations have to ask themselves these like pretty elemental questions. Like we can build a lot of complex policies and systems, but it has to come down to some very, very quite elemental unrigging of a system that I think they're individual anti-racist questions and they're organizational anti-racist questions that we sort of have to like sort of put forward. And I think that's important. And so I think we have, I'm just being mindful of our time and looking at questions. So if you have a question and you'd like to put it in the chat, that would be great. And I'm looking at one in the Q&A. So Dustin asks, can someone be more specific about what solidarity economy is? I put art.coop, and I think Ruffin and several of you spoke about solidarity-based resources, but would anybody like to offer the thumbnail of solidarity economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think Caroline and Nati did a great job with art.coop, so I'll just definitely spend time on that site. I'm a huge fan of their work.
I would also say that Dustin, Angie Kim and the CCI team, and as well as some of the original authors behind that, are actually modeling a cooperative research paper right now that'll be public soon about sort of how arts organizations, higher ed, and kind of more institutional actors could be supportive of worker co-ops, and particularly creative worker co-ops. And I think it's good, solid reading, and it's beautifully done behind the scenes as well in terms of a model of collaborative work. Please, anybody else jump in? Thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to just bring something into the conversation, which is, I don't think this is doom and gloom. But there is sort of a positive deviant model to look at, which is there are a number of creative workers who do very well for themselves and have done even better for themselves during the pandemic. And how do we look to those creatives and form networks with those creatives to really figure out how folks who are working in more traditional ways? I'm thinking about NFT artists. I'm thinking about folks who sort of jump in early in their careers into larger corporations, make some money, and then are able to come back and feed back into the sort of creative economy that we're working in. So I do just want to call that in as, you know, maybe another model that we pay attention to, which is, and, you know, for those of us who are, you know, teaching or in institutions, how do we help people become nimble in terms of being prepared for well-paid labor when they need it, so they can sort of, can I curse on here? Have I cursed yet? I haven't yet. But like your fuck you fund. So they can work someplace, get their fuck you fund, and then go and do what they want to do creatively for 6 months or a year until they go back to find a job. So I'm also I'm thinking a lot about those workers that I hang with.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that too, because I'm kind of on that path myself. And it's I think one thing that has also been on my mind is, how do we encourage institutions to just hire more artists or people of creative backgrounds to help reshape and rethink how they operate in their institutions. And I can say things without fear, because I'm on a project that's on its way out. But like when I came to my quote unquote day job, there was a lot of antiquated protocol and practices that took place. I remember I had introduced them to Zoom so we could do some webinars, and that was like a big deal. It was like, oh, well, this is technology we're not familiar with. And so just having a creative everywhere in any institution, or creatives, I should say, because not just one to bear that burden, but they bring a mindset that helps to shift the overall culture of an organization. And tech sector and more media design fields are sort of adopting this more, and we're seeing more positions like an art director or creative director in organizations, but we're not seeing them in leadership roles. We're not seeing them providing overall practical vision in an institution. And so I think that's an important direction that, as we think about the future of creative work, is also creating opportunity for mobility, because I've been on that side, as someone who worked in the nonprofit sector as an art program director, and then worked in government, and never worked in government in an art role, but in an urban planning and policy researcher role, where I brought my artistic practice and got a lot of pushback for doing so. And then when it would work out, then it would be embraced. But by then I was already burned out. And so if we just built a culture around embracing that kind of creativity, and I think we could inspire institutions to not look at it as risky. This idea of being creative is somehow triggers risk aversion for some reason, or this idea of creating space for experimental practice and just in general experimentation that creatives bring is always viewed upon as risky in certain spaces. And if we were to advocate and push for more, it's a little abstract, but I think it's actually a really important place of advocacy, is to try to get more institutions to embrace creatives.
Some of those qualities, Alyssa, that you were bringing up remind me of, I don't know, I can't remember who created this, but there's a sort of summary of white supremacy culture characteristics that surfaces from time to time, and I'll put it in the chat here. But some of those that you brought up are fear, one right way, which is also perfectionism, paternalism, which I think we've talked about, and objectivity, the either or the binary, things are either A or B, denial and defensiveness, fear of conflict or right to comfort, and individualism, urgency. And there's some really nice illustrations. If you scroll down to the bottom, that's where the summaries are. And I think it's helpful to assume that when you inherit an institution or a role within an institution, like most likely you are also inheriting that culture of white supremacy that is infused in the institution. So for those of us who are, have positions within institutions, it's helpful for BIPOC independent folks, when we engage with those institutions, for them to be aware of the ways in which they perpetuate that culture, whether or not you're consciously aware of it every moment that you're operating. A lot of the institutions that we interface with inherently have that culture embedded within them. I also just wanted to mention that I have had to think a lot the last 2 years or so for myself about the difference between income and wealth. Um, and how does that make its way into how I negotiate a contract or my rate? And I think recognizing that, there are vast differences in wealth and intergenerational wealth between different groups of people, especially by race, nationality, other factors, and ability, that might affect how we charge you. And that is real and that's fair. And for those of you that might be negotiating contracts with independent people, especially BIPOC individuals, just like take that into account. That it might be different, and like we're also, independent folks just of any racial background are also, we have these other costs that we have to cover. It's not just like I get to go out with that $120 an hour rate and like go have dinner. It's like I'm paying for my healthcare, I'm paying for my technology, I'm paying for my used to pay for my co-working space before all that stuff. And then also just considering, what does intergenerational wealth have to do with the rate? Because if it doesn't,
I charge reparation fees,
should.
so I'm with you on that.
There you go. Yeah, and then also like I'm super curious how all of you are writing, like clarifying that in your rates. Are you, we're constantly like having to prove the value of this over and over, but there's, we just have to do that education. It's where things are.
Well, for me, and we can talk more about like the structure offline because it's a little complicated, but I basically developed a matrix, a fee matrix, depending on agency size, staff size, and budget. And so I charge on a sliding scale. And then there are certain clients, they may not ask for it, but I will just throw in there racial equity training and then charge them for that. And then explain to them after the fact, like, you need this. Like, you asked me to come in here because you wanted someone with a social equity lens, but you need to have that lens too, because otherwise we're going to be fighting the whole time. And, like you can tell from the very beginning when you have a client that's going to be pushing back on all of your equitable approaches, like even though they say they want it because they don't get it, they're going to fight you about the strategies that you wish to take and the approaches you wish to take and how you want to invest resources. So there are often times where I'll just put that into the contract and say, I know you didn't ask for training, but we're going to give it to you. And in some cases we charge reparations fees, which we also tell the client off the bat, like, I'm going to charge you this extra amount to cover these set of costs. And that also includes sometimes the stress and burnout of having to go through extra hoops just to get in the door. But it also means that we have to be very selective about who we pick as clients, which means that we're not doing a whole lot of projects at times that normal agencies or comparable agencies would be able to do.
That's really tremendous, and I would really be interested in this matrix because it's a lot better than my kind of like intuitive like let me just see if that goes. But I think first, to Mallory, your earlier point about just recognizing that a rate is not the money that goes into somebody's bank account. Like we are, for better or for worse, we are building our own agencies, our own companies. Like, there's the overhead costs and the just expenses that are holistic. They're psycho-emotional expenses, they're somatic expenses, us being cramped over our computers for 14-hour days and that being normalized takes a toll. But I think too, like, oh, sorry, I just kind of lost my train of thought. But Alonso, what you were just saying in terms of like this idea of scaling, and it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, looking at this really tremendous resource about white supremacy culture, and how I think as artists, like, our tendency is actually like to burrow deep and to like explore the depths instead of this concept of like exponential scale. And how can we do meaningful work have ambition and motivation, but not feel like growth is the only motivator because that's so deeply capitalist. And I think that like I hold that too in my work. It's like, how am I not being encouraged by this concept of like exponential scale at the risk of a flattening of the depth and the meaningfulness of my work. And yeah, I think, I don't know, that's just what I'm sitting with. I'll just say that.
Ruffin, do you have a last thought?
No, I was just sitting here thinking about the asshole tax. That was it. I was just like, yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful thing where you have that suspicion that we're not mission aligned, but in order to make this work palatable, or in order for me to give you my genius, I'm going to charge you more for that because we're not true partners in the work.
I would just say fair, beyond fair, actually. I mean,
Reparation fees.
as we
Reparation fees.
as we kind of like end up, I'm just been sitting with I don't know if any of you have read the Ford Creative Futures essays that came out last summer, but Taylor Renee Aldridge, who's a curator and writer, sort of offered this conversation about the plurality of I, and like the idea that culture work is really a movement, is a mass movement of widespread fellowship. And kind of spending time with each of you makes me feel like we're in a mass movement of widespread fellowship. And, you know, the session was about the future of creative work. I mean, you all are the current and future of creative work. You are creative workers. And I think it's contingent on us as individuals and as institutional actors to just listen and do what creative workers are telling us over and over and over again, which is liberate resources, get out of our own way, support labor, support movement building, support solidarity space, and listen and center workers, support self-determination of workers, period. And the health of all workers is the health of creative workers. Ruffin very smartly said, what did you say? Like culture workers are just workers, and we're all kind of poor, right? Something to that. So you said it much more eloquently than that. So
I don't know. I'm always worried when anyone tries to remember what I said.
Knowledge, and I'm always messing it up. So that's pretty standard, really. Let's just leave it at that. So I want to express deep appreciation for everyone here, and for this movement of widespread fellowship, which I think is what it takes, is the connections. So anyone else have a better last word than that? Mine was very clunky. So all right, everyone. I just want to thank West Staff and thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you later.